A quick news update before we get to our daily Coping with COVID video interview. Today, BC Minister of Municipal Affairs, Selena Robinson, announced a series of measures aimed at financially helping municipalities through the COVID-19 pandemic. These include greater flexibility to carry debt for an additional year, as well as allowing local governments to borrow interest-free from their capital reserves to help pay for operating expenses, including paying for employee salaries. The province also launched today the BC Business COVID-19 Support Service. It will make advisors available to businesses either by phone, email, or live chat, there to answer any questions businesses or business owners may have about available resources, both at the provincial and federal levels, to help businesses through the COVID-19 outbreak. And finally, the Vancouver Aquarium at risk of bankruptcy. The revenue at the tourist attraction near zero. Meanwhile, its costs exceeding $1 million per month. The aquarium is appealing to both provincial and federal governments for some assistance. Thanks for watching. Here's our Coping with COVID interview.
You're watching Coping with COVID-19 for Thursday, April 16th. I'm Hayley Woodin. My guest today, Dave Earle, President and CEO of the BC Trucking Association. Dave, hope you're doing well. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
A couple of things I want to get to in our conversation today, but first I thought we could start out by asking what's happening in the industry right now. What are you hearing from members who, of course, on many fronts are providing very essential services to us in BC and also Canadians across the country?
Yeah, it's been a really remarkable time. Like many industries, and of course most sectors, trucking is very broad and very diverse. So right from the get-go, we have members that were incredibly busy. Those members that are delivering consumer products to supermarkets that you and I rely on for our day-to-day needs. We're absolutely, full capacity all the way through the first half of March. And after that started, kept going to try and basically catch up from the consumption that occurred. But in that back half of March, we started to see other economic activity start to dwindle and start to be affected. And of course, given that trucking really moves the goods that companies rely on every day, when those companies aren't operating, we don't have goods to move. So as times passed, we moved through a process where it was really an all hands on deck. Let's make sure we can figure out how to keep the industry running. We managed to get through that process. Now we're into a place where we're trying to get a real handle on where we're at and what the next month or two looks like as we get ready to turn things back on.
What would you say is the industry's biggest challenge at this point in time?
Number one challenge at this point in time is cash flow. These are companies very often with fixed assets, fixed costs. And right now it's a matter of finding that cash flow to be able to come in to continue to operate. Many members are doing relatively well, I suppose is the word we could use. And the first word, relatively, is the important one, because they're able to continue to operate. Their customers are still shipping goods and still having economic activity. Other members are just having a devil of a time trying to find a way to get some cash flow in that front door. They're finding circumstances where they'll deliver product and the company shuts down before the bill is paid, or the back end office staff aren't as productive and as fluid as it has been. So there's delays in payments. So that number one issue has been cash flow for sure.
When it comes to, say, social distancing requirements and measures that have been put in place in provinces across the country, has that proven a challenge for truck drivers at certain points along their journey, perhaps not driving, but when it comes to delivering goods or clearing through inspection stations or things like that?
It really has. And what's been interesting with that is how it's evolved over time. Again, that first couple week period, we were all paying attention to social distancing on a person by person basis. So business would continue, the interactions would happen, but they would maintain that appropriate social distance. As time evolved, we've now got into a really interesting time where there's some real good creativity happening, where companies are bringing in new protocols, where receipt of goods and completion of paperwork is being done virtually, where the separation at different terminals is maintained completely by the individuals working, if not entirely alone, then separated by many, many meters. But what that's led to, of course, is issues around accessing sites and accessing washrooms. So what's happened, we've had some experience with drivers who are reporting to sites to make a delivery, and security at the site will ask if they have been traveling outside of Canada in the previous 14 days. The driver, if they have, will advise, well, yes, I have. And at that point, they'll be banned or not allowed to enter the site. And the driver will say, well, you do understand the goods I have in my trailer also came from the United States 3 days ago. I went to get them for you. Where would you like me to put them? So those types of interactions have been a little difficult to manage. This week, we have put together a series of informational documents for both drivers and shippers, receivers, as well as companies to use to talk about the protocols, to talk about strategies, tips, and techniques to be able to use as we move forward in this environment where really this is going to be with us for a while. So we're trying to give those directions and degree of comfort to everybody to understand what to expect, where the risks are, and how to mitigate those risks.
Are drivers exempt from that federal announcement that anyone traveling into Canada from abroad, they need to have a plan in place to self-quarantine?
Well, yes, there's a couple of exemptions that apply to commercial drivers. Number one, the requirement for them to self-isolate upon return and self-quarantine now upon return does not apply to commercial drivers. Having said that, what we're seeing is a lot of drivers and companies are taking arrangements very similar to what you see in the healthcare environment, where individuals are self-isolating at home, where different drivers, we've actually heard of circumstances where they will go out and actually retain accommodation as a group of 2 or 4 drivers. So when a couple of them are on the road, they've got some place to come back to. When they come back to Canada, that's away from their families, just in an abundance of caution. So while they're not subject to that strict requirement, they certainly do have to self-monitor. They have to report in and make sure that if they are symptomatic or they are exposed to someone who is positive for COVID, that they take those appropriate steps. So that's one step. The recent requirements that were established to require that individuals that are coming back not only have a plan, but they file that plan and have it approved. We didn't know that that was coming, and it presented a really serious issue. The rationale behind it makes a lot of sense in terms of tracking individuals. But when you have drivers that are literally transiting the border 3 to 4 times a day, it didn't really make a lot of sense. It's very different if you're moving a load from Wisconsin to Dawson Creek. You cross somewhere in the prairies and drive up and enter into British Columbia. Well, how do you file a plan? Who approves it? Who doesn't? Where do you go? It's not a static border crossing. So we work very closely with CBSA and with both the Provincial Health Officer and the Public Health Agency of Canada and confirmed that, yes, indeed, drivers are exempt from filing that plan and having that plan approved. But what we've been saying to our members is the same principles apply for your drivers. It's critical that if a driver is self-monitoring and they're on a long run from here to Winnipeg, if they become symptomatic in outside Regina, that's not the time to be thinking, gee whiz, what do I do now? We need to have these plans in place. We need to have resources for drivers to be able to access and use, and our members are working diligently to put those in place.
Has the process of crossing our Canada-US border changed very much? What is it like for members and their drivers who are having to cross that, as you said, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day?
There's a lot less light vehicle traffic, sure. And that's something we hear from drivers continuously, is that it sure is a lot easier moving around the country because there's a lot less light vehicle traffic. The delays really haven't been extensive. It's certainly at the borders, both CBP going south and CBSA heading north have been very good about making sure that drivers are processed appropriately. They're being asked a lot more questions than they were before in terms of symptomology and their history. They're being observed a lot more closely to make sure that they're not exhibiting those symptoms. But certainly the flow of goods continues, and while it's a little bit of a bottleneck, it's more than made up for by the lighten of traffic on either side.
I know Tim Hortons announced, I think last week, that they were going to reopen 400 or so restaurants across the country along major highways to support truck drivers who maybe need to use facilities there. They can access food and drink, what have you. Made me really think about what facilities may or may not be open, given that we've had so many restaurants close and they're only open, say, for takeout or drive-through options. What are some of the facilities that drivers use regularly, and have they remained open?
Yeah, this has been a really unanticipated issue for us. I mean, we never contemplated what would happen if every dining room restaurant in Canada shut down. And the impact on it was quite extraordinary, particularly a couple of weeks ago, where drivers literally had nowhere to stop. There were problems at rest stops with people using them a lot more, rating them for supplies. So highway maintenance contractors were having a tough time keeping up with that. And then just the availability. These drivers can't swing a 53-foot trailer through a drive-through lane, and they can't walk up. So we started working very quickly with major chains and major restaurants, and we've also launched an initiative, Meals for Truckers, with making links between commercial card lock sites, food truck vendors, and getting those entities hooked up so they can actually get some business, serve the truckers that are there, because the other facilities just aren't as frequent or as open as they used to be, and provide some business for local small business that's also struggling. So it's been a really, really interesting and successful initiative.
Yeah, I've seen on social media some of the photos of food service providers stepping up. I think I've seen Thank a Trucker Thursday on social media as well. What kind of support have you seen from the private sector on this?
It's been staggering. We actually will be going live with a website either tomorrow or early next week that will be searchable and be able to act as a clearinghouse to set up and make these links, because we're finding we have food trucks that want to be involved, we have commercial sites that want to be involved, and we have corporate sponsorship. The vast majority of the trucks that are operating, the food trucks that are operating now in British Columbia, we've got them Chilliwack, Kamloops, Kelowna, Prince George, and multiple sites in some of those locations. They're being sponsored by the private sector, where companies are stepping forward and saying, you know what, we're going to buy the meals for everybody today. We're going to spend a few $100s and support those truckers. We actually had a private individual in Kelowna come forward and in Kamloops come forward and donate $2,500 out of their own pocket to say thank you and provide those meals to truck drivers. So it's been extraordinary. Once we get this website up and running in the coming days, we'll be pushing it out across the country to make sure that it's a one-stop shop for drivers to know where they can go, where they can get in, where they can get out, what services are available, and where they can get a bite to eat and relieve themselves and perhaps take a shower.
Do you think that this pandemic has provided an opportunity for people to really think about the role that truck drivers play in supporting our economy, and maybe even thinking about, okay, if we see an event like all restaurants shutting down, how do we ensure that this very important piece of our economy and our supply chain has what it needs?
Yeah, it's been a real interesting process to go through. When you think about that, with the industry's always been very invisible. Somehow magically, when you and I go to a supermarket, everything we want is there. We go to a Home Depot, everything we want is there. And that supply chain has been incredibly effective, unbelievably resilient, and completely invisible. In this crisis, because of what we've been dealing with, there's been a lot more attention paid and a lot more understanding of the critical work that these companies and these drivers in particular do. When you go into a supermarket and you look and there's two aisles that are completely empty, it kind of dawns on you, well, wait a minute, this stuff doesn't just magically appear. There's a very complex and highly sophisticated machine in the background to make sure it gets here. It's been really great to see the support from the public, from the business community, recognizing the work that drivers do. And I can tell you, absolutely, they appreciate the recognition.
Do you think at this point there's anything that might permanently change, be it processes, behaviors, attitudes, whatever it might be, concerning trucking in this part of our industry? Or is it too early to tell exactly what might stay and what might revert back to the way things were?
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting question, I think, for all of us in every industry. Certainly in ours, what I see is the changes in the paperwork flow and verification flow. from shipper to receiver, and how waybills are communicated, how goods are received, how disputes are resolved, all of those types of things, because of the need to reduce contact and that creativity that's been brought into that space. I anticipate that certainly sticking around. And I'm also hopeful that the recognition that the industry is getting right now continues, and that we all understand how really important it is.
Absolutely. Dave, thanks so much for coming on the show with your insight. Really appreciate it.
Anytime, and thanks for having me.
That's Dave Earle, President and CEO of the BC Trucking Association. Thanks so much for watching Coping with COVID-19. We'll be back with another video tomorrow.